Okay, great. So I thought I'd like to, talk to you guys today about some strategies for high-resolution fMRI. Now I'm happy to have sort of an informal presentation. So if you guys want to interrupt me at any point, please go ahead. I think I made the presentation a little bit short, so there should be plenty of time for questions. Okay. So with that, let's see if this works. Okay, great. So the theme of today's talk is going to be high-resolution 7T fMRI. So recent advances in MR technology, such as massively parallel seed coil arrays, commercial high-field systems, give us images with smaller boxes. Here's an example of some of our 0.75 millimeter isotropic single-shot EPI we can achieve at 7 Tesla. What's interesting is that when Larry first put the 7T in Charlestown, people said you're never going to get EPI to work. And what's funny is that with this new hardware, we're actually able to get better EPI images at 17 than at 15. We can appreciate the anatomical quality of these images, but what's amazing is that these are the images that we're using for our fMRI. Okay, so with such small voxels, the question becomes: is the accuracy of our measurement really limited by the voxel size, or by what we call the sort of biological resolution, the coupling between the hemodynamic response and neural activity and the underlying neural activity that we're seeking to measure? And this is going to be again one of the questions that I want to address during this talk. So this kind of quick introduction, I just want to give you. Oh, okay, all right, it's interesting. Okay, I'd like to give you a quick outline of what I'd like to talk to you about today. So first, I'll talk a little bit about resolution, distortion, and image acquisition, and ask the question, what dictates voxel size? Of course, if we want to do high resolution, we need to make sure that our images are accurate. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about the biological limits and resolution. This will be mostly kind of a literature review, and I would like to ask the question, how fine scale is the hemodynamic regulation, the biological resolution that we're interested in. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about surface-based analysis methods and ask the question, can an anatomically informed sampling method from our signal give us improved accuracy? And then finally, I'd like to wrap up with a kind of survey of some novel acquisition techniques that we've been developing in the lab that you guys might be interested in. That's the question again, how can we combine data across different modalities, anatomical, functional, structural diffusion? Okay, so with that little overview, first, as I mentioned, I'm going to be mostly focusing on 7 Tesla high field fMRI. Now, the bulk sensitivity, as you guys know, increases with field strength. Across the board, SNR goes up as we go to higher field strengths. But what's nice about fMRI is that because the delta T distortion changes also increase, we get a nice kick in contrast to noise ratio as well, which is exactly what we need for fMRI. So this is nice. We get actually a super linear increase in functional CNR as we increase field strength. So that's as long as we're thermal dominant. I'll say a little bit more about this later. This translates to a reduction in scan time. So for population studies, fewer subjects are required. Also, we can do single subject analyses, potentially, single patient, diagnostics, but also it enables us to have smaller voxels. We can spend this increased CNR to achieve smaller voxels, which means we can nyquist sample the cortex, which is nice. We get reduced partial volume effects, less noise contribution from surrounding CSF and white matter. Also, as we go to higher field strengths, there is some weighting towards smaller vessels. We will not have much potential to talk about today, but this is another kind of feature of going to high field strengths. Now, as many of you know, there's some distortions and artifacts potentially that we go to higher field strengths. The strategy that we use to mitigate, I like to think of as kind of a hardware-enabled solutions to get around these distortions, such as fast, strong head gradients, and nowadays we actually have fast, strong body gradients, and of course high-end receive coil arrays. So these two technologies together enable us to achieve faster acquisitions, faster EPI readouts, which gives us less distortion and less blurring. We're essentially able to sort of outrun the distortions. Just to give you a quick kind of sense for how we apply this in Bay 5. So here's an example. This is just 2 millimeter isotropic single-shot EPI. You can see the sort of classic macroscopic susceptibility gradient distortions around the frontal sinuses and ear canals wherever we see kind of tissue air interfaces. So this is classic what we expect to see at 7 Tesla. With a little bit of acceleration here, accelerated by a factor of 2, you actually see a lot of that distortion is mitigated. That's because we effectively reduce the echo spacing and therefore reduce the amount of distortion in the EPI in the phase encoding direction. We can push this a little bit further, go 3, 4, 5. As we accelerate more and more, the effective echo spacing goes down and the distortion decreases. Again, we're outrunning the distortions. There's some limits. This is with a 32-channel coil built by Boris. As we go further and further, 6, 7, 8, we start to break down. We start to pull in some defect artifacts and some noise cancellation. So there's some limit to how far we can push the parallel imaging acceleration. But as you can appreciate, between R-equals 1 and R-equals 4, we can actually eliminate a lot of this distortion at the scanner just through kind of tailoring the acquisition and taking into account the fact that longer readouts increase the distortion. Another issue that we have at 17 or higher fields is deep and dropout. Again, we have susceptibility regions, tissue air interfaces around frontal sinuses and the ear canals. This is sort of an exaggerated example, 6 millimeters isotropic, although, I'm sorry, 6 millimeter thick slice, although it's sort of a clinical slice thickness. One way to mitigate this, artifact is just to make the slices thinner and thinner. Because we have rs-fMRI, we can actually achieve smaller and smaller slice thicknesses, so 5, 4, 3. As we make the slice thinner and thinner, there's less dephasing across the slice and therefore less dropout, 2, 1. As we go to 1 millimeter thick slices, or even 0.75, which, in a lot of cases you have with FNNDSC to cheese, you can almost eliminate this free-flow dropout. So this is another strategy for reducing some of the distortions that we see at high fields. Another issue that we need to take into account is that, beyond just the distortion, there are some blurring effects due to the long readouts in EPI that we get in both gradient echo and spin echo EPI readouts. Different forms of distortion, but what happens is, because there's a relaxation during the readout, there's a multiplicative weighting across K-space, which translates into a convolution or blurring in the image domain. So these forms of blurring in the slow encoding direction or the phase encoding direction need to be taken into account for high resolution imaging. So what's interesting is that this voxel blur in the phase encoding direction is a function of the duration. Here I've plotted the stretching of the voxels in the phase encoding direction as a function of the EPI readout. Now note this is beyond the sort of normal point spread function of the voxel that's due to the Fourier truncation. This is the blurring primarily due to the voxel blur in the phase encoding direction. Now, what's interesting is that this is a function of T2 star. So a general rule of thumb is that if the EPI readout duration is equal to T2 star, you get about a 4% blur of the voxel in the phase encoding direction. And the problem is that T2 star varies across the brain. That's sort of an extrinsic property, depends on the shim and on the voxel size and so forth. So in parts of the brain where there's a slightly shorter T2 star, such as in the frontal cortex, you're actually going to get more blurring as a function of EPI readout duration. And parts of the brain where the T2 star is a little bit longer, such as in visual cortex, you might get a little bit less blurring. But what this means is that you're getting a spatially varying blur across the image as a function of the local T2 star and EPI readout duration. This needs to be taken into account. What this also means is that parallel imaging, by shortening the EPI readout duration, actually also can reduce blur. Not only does it reduce the sort of geometric distortion, but can reduce blurring in the EPI images. Now, another issue that we have with some of the sort of modern gradient coils, a lot of these modern gradient coils have been designed with a little bit of gradient nonlinearity built in. This is how they achieve a little bit higher performance, like the Connectome scanner. So this gradient nonlinearity causes some geometric distortion in the images. It also causes some intensity bias when there's sort of a pixel pileup. That can also cause a spatially non-uniform voxel size. Now, these first two we can correct. This third one, not so easy, but at least we can characterize it. So to give you a demonstration of what the gradient nonlinearity looks like, in our 7 Tesla, here's an EPI image, before and after gradient nonlinearity correction. You see there's actually a pretty big shift, especially in the cerebral cortex there. But if you zoom in, you can actually see that when we correct the image, there's some blurring induced. That's because we get some subvoxel shifts, so we have to resample the image onto our voxel grid. It requires interpolation, and this blurs the image. So again, this is an issue which can also reduce the spatial resolution of the image. One strategy for getting around this is to, rather than resampling the EPI images themselves, what we do for our fMRI analyses using surfaces is actually deform the surfaces instead. So this is nice because it allows us to avoid the sort of unnecessary resampling of the EPI images. But the point is that, which can also not only cause a reduction in spatial resolution, but can also introduce spurious correlations in the data. So again, there's some strategies that we can investigate for avoiding this blurring and still taking into account the geometric distortion due to the gradient nonlinearity. As I mentioned, the gradient nonlinearity also affects voxel sizes. In places where the gradient is a little bit stronger than what it's supposed to be restricted because it's a little bit higher than linear, we actually get smaller voxels than what we intend. In places where the gradient is weaker, we get bigger voxels. So here's sort of a map. What's interesting is that this is the this is ACD4. What's funny is that you see the red region in the cerebellum. The voxels are bigger than what they're supposed to be, but in visual cortex they're smaller, which is good news for us. But the point is, this is yet another source of spatially varying resolution in the images that we need to take into account. Now, with all of these distortions and artifacts I mentioned to you, again, we do get an increase in CNR as we go to higher fields. Here's an example from Christina. This is a whole brain high-resolution mixed-state network, default mode, 0.75 ISO. We can see the default mode network is 6 minutes of scanning, so this is really nice. Again, really small voxels, but we have enough CNR to be able to see the nodes of this network pretty clearly. Also, you might imagine with such thin slices, it takes a long time to recover the entire brain. So we're using other parallel imaging techniques such as Collins, simultaneous multi-slice EPI with a blip type of shift. This can enable us to achieve the high resolution of the entire brain. This is, I think, our first example. This is 1 millimeter isotropic, multiband 3, factor of 2 acceleration in plane. Here we're able to achieve whole brain 1 millimeter isotropic
API, single shot in under 3 seconds. And so
basically, so multiband refers to the pulses on it. So we use these multiband pulses to achieve this simultaneous multi-slice acquisition. And simultaneous multi-slices existed for 15 years or so. Multiband was one step, and the next step was kind of the synaptic type, which really improved the G factor to really make it usable. But yes, we refer to multiband factor, which corresponds to how many bands we have in these slice selective pulses. Now we've pushed this a little bit further. This is some data from a couple of weeks ago. I wanted to push the system as far as it go. This is, if you're deploying this help, this is actually the Steve team. That's a recon that is in 2 points. Just 1. It's 2.1. Okay, thanks. This example, I don't know if I showed this to you already, but this is multiband 4 R equals 4 in plane. So a total acceleration factor of 16. So note that there is an interaction between the multiband acceleration and the slice acceleration and in-plane acceleration. So typically, if you increase the acceleration of 1, which would come into the performance of the level. So we like to think of the total acceleration factor as the limit. So here, this is a total acceleration factor of 16 with our 32-channel coil. Again, this is really enabled by some improvements that we've made recently to the image reconstruction, notably the Steve's leak block and faster reconstruction. Just wanted to show you guys this very quickly. Okay, so with that, I'd like to move on. I've talked a little bit about resolution and distortion in image acquisition with some Hight to 7 Tesla fMRI. Now to talk a little bit about the biological limits on resolution and see how fine scale of hemodynamic regulation may be. And we're interested in this because lately we've been working on looking at the spatial heterogeneity of specificity, looking at the tangential specificity of the bold response as a function of depth. And we've also been recently looking at interradial specificity to see if there's any evidence for laminar level regulation of the response that we need in order to see functional differences between different cortical layers. And of course, these 2 characterizations are going to be needed for both columnar and laminar features of the functional architecture. But there have been some recent studies that have shown differences in bold response properties across the layers, usually showing either earliest or greatest blood flow response or bold response in central layers. This has been seen with many different studies: granicle bold, spinacle bold, CBV using a blood pool contrast agent like Myon, CBF using ASL, and differences between these signal sources. But what's tricky about these studies is that they typically use stimuli to sort of activate the entire column. You see a slight difference in the blood response in the central cortical layers. So this isn't necessarily evidence for kind of local blood flow regulation. Exactly. That's what I'm making. Yeah, exactly. On the next slide. Yeah, so they don't. People have seen for example, like CBV changes, mostly the highest in central cortical layers, but now you can tell the fact that, as I was about to mention, the vascular layer is very similar to the cell layers. We have this very high density capillary bed, as I was saying in layer 4. So the fact that people are seeing larger CBV changes may just be reflecting some uninteresting kind of vascular physiology across layers. It's not really indicative of local blood flow control that we would need in order to see functional differences between different cortical layers. And it's interesting, the vascular layers are very similar to the cell layers. I mean, we know that there's some adaptation, there's some plasticity of the vasculature. What's interesting here is another example. Here, this is showing, again, a very dense capillary bed in layer 4, but just to orient you, this isn't human. This is the calcareous sulcus. This is the white matter. You actually see the density of this capillary bed actually fall very abruptly after the V1 So here's another example that the vasculature actually follows the functional architecture very closely. So it's very difficult to tease these things apart. And I think that a lot of these studies have seen differences in, say, layer 4, but as you were just saying, I mean, these could be just reflective of the sort of increased capillary density there. So we're not really sure how to interpret these studies. However, there has been some evidence for fine-scale blood flow regulation using techniques other than fMRI. We've seen earliest and greatest flow responses in middle layers using hydrogen clearance probes. People have seen peak stimulus-evoked blood flow rate using laser Doppler and audio radiography in specific layers. Actually, one of my favorites is people have demonstrated flow responses within individual glomeruli using 2-photon microscopy. And this is cool because in the olfactory bulb, you have sort of this continuous network of capillaries. Each glomerulus is about 10 microns. And what they did, they stimulated one organ, and they saw blood flow diverted to a single glomerulus. So that's blood flow regulation at a scale of about 10 microns. So this was sort of surprising. It was really cool as 2-photon microscopy. But the question is, since all the regulation, the mechanisms for blood flow regulation appear to be in the material science, that's where the smooth muscle tissue is. How is it that there is such fine-scale blood flow regulation for capillary? There's no smooth muscle tissue on the capillary, so how can this be?
Well, people have identified some mechanisms for blood flow regulation that could be at the spatial scale of capillaries. People have seen, first of all, direct neural control of vascular sphincters that feed the capillaries, which could be giving us some increased specificity. But also, intriguingly, people have seen regulation of capillary diameter through pericytes. So we don't need smooth muscle tissue. Pericytes are these kind of non-neural cells that wrap their appendages around the vessels. These are able to be contractile, so they can regulate the vessel diameter. What's amazing is this is one of my favorite slides, and I think that this is a movie showing capillary dilation after stimulating a pericyte with an electrode. This is in preparation, test preparation. This isn't an abstract scatter plot. This is a video. You can actually see red blood cells trying to move the capillary. What's cool here is that this is the pericyte here in the capillary. You see it this way. So is kind of stopped through the capillary because the capillary diameter is restricted. But what's cool is that a few moments after this capillary is stimulated, you can see the other two pericytes subsequently downstream also get restricted. So what this means is that there's some coordination, of the pericyte constriction both upstream and downstream along this pattern. So it seems to be some mechanism for signaling between these pericytes. I think this is fascinating. That study was actually done in the slice preparation, so the issue there was that blood pressure wasn't really in vivo levels, so people weren't sure if we could see pericyte constriction in vivo. But just recently, actually, the same group reproduced these results. They were able to demonstrate pericyte dilation of capillaries in vivo. What's amazing is that they saw that the pericyte dilation actually preceded the feeding arterial dilation. So it's not like they're responding to upstream increases in signal flow. And it seems that they really are able to regulate a blood flow, and they estimated about 84% of cerebral blood flow could be regulated by pericytes. So this is an interesting mechanism. And again, we've also seen, in a previous study, signal propagations on endothelial cells and make up the vessel wall. So it looks like signaling can occur along blood vessels to give rise to this sort of coordinated blood flow regulation along the really small vessels. So I think all of this evidence sort of suggests that the blood flow regulation in the brain is much on a much higher scale than was previously computed. People think that the blood flow regulation may be the scale of 2 millimeters or so, which is going to be the biological resolution and ultimately the limit. But then in functional imaging methodology like fMRI or optical, it's based on blood flow regulation. But I think that these studies have demonstrated to us that blood flow regulation is much more precise and accurate than was previously computed. And so with this,
spatial, but it's a temporal.
Yeah, exactly. And so what's interesting too, and what I think I can show you some slides afterwards. People have been looking at neuropsychiatric endpoints, and what they're seeing is that there is a very early response, not always a good. We do see a positive response very, very early, and the onset of that response also seems to vary with distance from the vascular. People see a very fast response from the central cortical with a slower response on the surface. What's actually interesting is that you actually do wind up seeing more of an initial dip at the surface because of the sort of blood flow regulation time mismatch. But the bottom line is it seems that the blood flow response kicks in like very quickly once we just had a recent study. And I think that's definitely sub-second. But the thing is it spreads, both spatially and temporally. So I do think that, dip or not, the early response does give you more specificity. People have shown this with integrated response. The question remains, exactly how fast is it? I know that one of the board just had a recent paper showing, very similar to the ATMO results, that you could see capillary dilation that preceded associated calcium signal, which also calls into question whether the astrocytes really play a dominant role in blood flow regulation. Maybe they're a little bit sluggish, right? Continue 1 or 2 seconds later, but we are seeing blood flow dilation, like vessel dilation, that precedes the astrocytes. So I think that there's a lot of evidence for very rapid, very precise blood flow regulation. And I think it probably depends on where you are, what brain area. But I think that a lot of the previous thinking about both spatial and temporal resolution of fMRI has been kind of revisited based on these results. And so with that, I'm just going to transition now into the next section. I'd like to talk a little bit about kind of analysis strategies for achieving high resolution fMRI. So again, we've got these small boxes here. So what can we do with them? So we know that it's possible to exploit the different spatial scales of vascular anatomy that we see in the cortex. This is a vascular corrosion cast from macaque V1. You see the large peel vessels that drain deoxygenated blood from large cortical domains. Here on the surface, we have the diving venules that penetrate perpendicularly into the cortex. And in the parenchyma, in the center of the cortex, you have this sort of dense limited over the capillary bed. So the idea is that if we can take our small voxels, we can exploit this sort of regularity or this hierarchy of vascular organization to perform what we call a sort of an anatomically informed sampling. So the idea is that if we consider our small voxels that are really here in the parenchyma, near to the capillary bed, where presumably the spatial coupling between the blood flow responses and the activity is the tightest, we can potentially achieve higher resolution. Whereas if we can sort of avoid voxels that are sitting near the pure veins, if you can drain blood from large to veins, we can sort of avoid those voxels. We could potentially remove some of the sources of spatial inaccuracy of our measurements. So in order to test this idea out, we employed the concept of retinotopy. So this is a property that's shared by many visual systems. It's the property in which nearby neurons possess receptive fields in a nearby visual field. So the idea is that every neuron in the visual cortex is looking at one spotlight in the visual field. If anything goes into that spotlight, the neuron fires. And what's interesting is that nearby neurons in the visual cortex have nearby spotlights. So if you kind of extrapolate this, what you see is that there's a topographic map of the visual field laid out in the cortical surface as part of a action cartoon. So the idea is that if the subject is looking at a particular scene, if you could image while they're looking at that, the pattern of neural activity, it would resemble the scene at the So then, one interesting feature of this mapping is that there's a variable magnification. There's actually more neurons devoted to representing the center of the visual field and then to the periphery. And this is reflected in the mapping. You see here in this cartoon, the representation of the spikes, which is in the center of the visual field, is expanded relative to the periphery of the visual field, which is represented in a much smaller cerebral cortex. Also note that the receptive field centers that give rise to this topographic mapping are organized in a columnar fashion. So we wanted to exploit this retinotopy in order to test this idea. In order to do this, we developed a novel cortical depth analysis. Was using our right surfaces, we identified the right surface as a FreeSurfer, and then evolved that surface out towards a field surface following local image intensity gradients and saving intermediate surfaces at different cortical depths. So in this case, we generated a family of surfaces. We have the two boundary surfaces, the interior and exterior boundary of the cortical gray matter, plus these sort of non-intermediate surfaces. And I'm showing the overlays of these surfaces, so the cross sections of these surfaces overlaid onto our roads. So again, what we did in this analysis is simply identify DPI voxels that intersected each of these surfaces. So in this analysis, we're actually generating one surface model per depth. And this enables us to perform sort of a laminar or depth analysis for large expanses of the cortex. So restricted to looking at what's more flat patchy tissue, as was previously performed for these laminar analyses. So as I mentioned, we want to exploit retinotopy, so we designed a resolution stimulus that used a retinolytic model to impose a desired activation pattern on the V1 surface. So for example, if we wanted to this is the pattern of neural activation, this would be a little bit. All we would do is calculate the visual stimulus that we would have to project in order to elicit this sort of pattern of activation. We can do this using a simple kind of mathematical transform. So again, we're sort of pre-distorting the visual stimulus. Here's what it looks like. Here we have our RM stimulus. So note, the retina kind of inverts the visual image. So we kind of flipped RM upside down. We presented one on the left visual field, one on the right visual field. So here's our condition A. It's a noise-filled M on a gray background. We contrasted this with a gray-filled M on a noise background. In order to drive the neurons in V1 crazy, we had this spatially scaled noise pattern that kind of flickered at 8 Hertz. We have to use a fixation task to minimize eye movement. Imagine if the subject's moving their eyes during this experiment, it's going to blur out the activation pattern of the surface. We really needed to make sure that the subjects were keeping accurate fixation. Actually, we limited these scans just to 5 minutes to make sure that the subjects didn't get fatigued to move their eyes all the way around. So here's what the activation looks like in the folded representation within a single slice. Again, what we did was we identified fMRI voxels that intersected our family of intermediate surfaces, and we just sampled the z-statistic of the activation as a function of cortical depth. Here's what the pattern looks like on the cortical surface representation. You guys are familiar with this. It's really tough to see the pattern in the folded representation. The arms with the pachycephalic surface and the folded representation, you can much more clearly see the spatial pattern of activation. Larry always likes to see the, well, of course, that's the point of this experiment is the spatial resolution, but also unthresholded kind of data. This is just the same thing shown in MATLAB. It's pretty clear. But again, the point of this experiment was to investigate the depth dependence, spatial accuracy, to test this idea of this vascular, whether we can exploit the vascular regularity. So when we sample this pattern near to the white matter surface, the spatial fidelity of the pattern is actually quite good. You can see the VM pretty clearly. But as you progressively sample closer and closer to those large PL vessels of the cortical surface, the spatial fidelity of the pattern breaks down systematically.
And I think in an interesting way, so this is one of my favorite artifacts, right here. It looks like maybe there's like some peel vessel that's sort of running across the background of the iris. So what's interesting is that we're seeing the spatial breakdown is interesting. First of all, it degrades as we step closer to the peel vessels, and maybe not surprising. But note that this resolution is not really well characterized by some isotropic Gaussian zero-made point spread function, and it's also not as if the pattern that we're measuring with the FreeSurfers is simply a blurred pattern of what we're seeing at the white surface. The pattern breaks down in a much more interesting way. I think I've already seen because small voxels are very much more sensitive to local details of the vascular anatomy. But also note that while the resolution breaks down as we settle closer to the surface, the Z statistics actually get a bit higher, which I think larger signal changes, which is to be expected. So we wanted to plot this. So here we're looking at the percent signal changes near to the white surface and plotting it as a function of depth all the way up to the peel surface. So we see about a 1.5% signal change near the white surface, but about twice that near the peel surface. Now again, that's not surprising because these large things are draining lots of blood, so we're actually getting higher and higher percent signal changes near to the peel surface. What this also means is that there's a trade-off here between sensitivity and specificity. It's kind of depressing that we get the most sensitivity near the peel surface exactly where the accuracy is the lowest, but this is also kind of nice. Every such a knob we can turn. If we need more specificity, say over the left surface. If we need more sensitivity, it's over to the peel surface. For these columnar activation patterns. We also want to look at the spatial variability of the percent signal change. So this is kind of the spatial variability of the percent signal changes. What this is reflecting is that when we sample near to the right surface, we get pretty much the same, like 1.5% signal change. It doesn't really vary very much. But when we sample near the peel surface, we see both big percent signal changes and small percent signal changes. And why is that? Well, we think that it's reflecting the spatial heterogeneity of vessel sizes near the peel surface. This is a photograph of the cortical surface. You see the vascular network. So we think that this is reflecting the broad distribution of vessel sizes. We have both big vessels and small vessels near the peel surface. So depending on the voxel, we may be seeing either big percent signal changes or small signal changes. So again, we think the spatial variability of the fluctuation amplitudes just reflects the spatial variability of the vessel sizes. So in summary, so we see a largest percent signal change exactly where the first is the lowest. So there's some trade-off here. And again, we see the spatial variability of the percent signal change and the pattern also increases as we sample closer to the peel surface. Now, it's tough to talk about high-resolution 7T fMRI without some mention of Spatial EPI. So as many of you know, at higher fields, we really get no intravascular signal because most of the deep cells are really short. So all of the signal change we see in bold is extravascular. And we know that from simulations, that we know that the spinacle is preferentially sensitive extravascular bold signal changes around small vessels. So it's been kind of promoted as a technique that can give us higher specificity because it's only sensitive to signal changes around the smallest vessels. So I wanted to test this out. We performed, this is just one subject. This is a little bit longer scan. We did a gradient echo and spin echo M. We didn't really see a big difference in the spatial spread. The hypothesis here was that if spin echo is only sensitive to small vessels, extravascular bold around small vessels, you would expect the spatial spread to be sort of tighter in the spin echo, and we wouldn't expect it to change very much as we sample closer to the surface. And this is sort of one subject, but you can see that I think the spatial spread is comparable. Now, note there's some issues here. The spin echo signal is a lot lower, and it's hard to kind of separate out kind of resolution effects from SNR effects. Maybe we need to kind of do like a more fair comparison. That's a little bit tricky. Like, how do we do this? And we can maybe click down on the gradient echo, or I think it's a little bit tricky. Also note that SAR limits coverage. This is funny. So I ran into a SAR limit on this experiment, so I had to cut down the number of slices. So actually accidentally cut off a little bit of the signal mode. This is another kind of practical issue with using spin echo API. And so again, I think we're going to need some SNR matched comparison. But what we learned from this experiment is that it's actually kind of tricky to actually get the benefit of spin echo API, these almost kind of simulations. Our readouts here are actually kind of wrong, and we're pulling in some potentially T2 or T2 effects. And that's because we're only really getting that pure T2 spin echo weighting at the echo in the center of K-space. And this phenomenon was actually nicely demonstrated by Nikos Logothetis' lab. So this is macaque visual cortex. So he first started off, this is a kind of a depth analysis. They measured the sensitive change of the peel surface on the molecular surface. He looked at the gradient echo bold, and he saw that, as expected, with a kind of simple visual stimulus, you got the peak gradient echo bold signal change around the cortical surface, on the peel vessels, and very similar to us. But then he performed a spin echo API, again at 4.7 Tesla, and again he found that the peak signal change is also again to the peel vessels, these large vessels. So why is that? Again, spin echo is supposed to be only sensitive to small vessels, although he's seeing a pretty big signal change on the large vessels. although there's kind of a secondary peak, kind of in the pentagonal where you'd expect it. So then, but he realized that there might be some, because of these long EPI readouts or some 2' weighting. So what he did was he reduced the readout by increasing the number of shots. So from a 4-shot spinnacle EPI, the 8-shot spinnacle EPI was halved the EPI readout, and less time effects. All of a sudden, you see that there's a peak spinnacle bolt seen in supracortical areas in the site of the smallest vessels. So we're seeing that the spinnacle signal is shifting towards the smaller vessels. As he went even one step further, 16-shot spinnacle EPI with a very short readout, so it's much more kind of approximating the effects themselves in simulations. You see that the peak bolts are occurring in the supracortical areas of the site of the smallest vessels. So what we're seeing here is that, in our experiments, we sort of here in the middle, we actually do have long readouts in the spinnacle EPI. Spinnacle EPI is difficult to use in practice because it requires super short readouts, which are necessitated to a segmented and multi-shot EPI, which in my hands is actually pretty challenging to pull off. So the point here is that, I wanted to address the spinnacle issue, but the point is that it's really challenging to get this to work in practice. Okay, and with that, I'd like to move on and I'd like to talk a little bit about some novel acquisition strategies. These are a couple of things that we've been working on in the lab and I thought that you guys might be interested in. So the first issue that we've been kind of tackling, especially for high-resolution fMRI, which I told you we were really relying a lot on heavy-duty, lots of parallel imaging. We're seeing some effects of motion during the ACS. So this is sort of a typical time series. You see this, this is a time series SNR map. We're seeing to see over and over again. This is sort of striped pattern. See discontinuous SNR across our slices whenever we're doing kind of high acceleration factors. Now, what we realized was that this is only occurring when we're using auto calibration data that was multi-shot. If we actually took the exact same data and calibrated it with a single-shot ACS acquisition, this discontinuous SNR just goes away. You also get a pretty big increase in SNR. And we were really puzzled by this at first. Why is this? We saw this both in the time series SNR and in image SNR. So it's not just a triple stability thing, it really is something to do with power management. I wanted to dig into this. We realized that this discontinuous SNR across slices, can be a real problem for any activation, studies in fMRI, of course DTI as well, because most of our fMRI studies are based, solving a detection problem. This is a real serious box. So we just kind of put this out. We looked into it. It looks like that this is due to some effects of motion or instability in the multi-shot ACS data that we require for construction. So any kind of subject motion, some patients that are prone to motion and you guys are interested in. Also, we're seeing that dynamic B0 changes due to respiration can also cause this. So the solution that we proposed is to just reorder the acquisition of these segments to minimize the time interval between segments in each slice to make these ACS acquisition less vulnerable. I just want to explain that really briefly. So in conventional kind of multi-slice EPI, what we do for our acquisition of the auto-calibration data is we use like multi-shot, and conventional multi-shot works like this. So say we have 3 shots. First we acquire segment A of slice 1, then segment A of slice 2, and segment A of slice 3, all the way down. And then after we've acquired all of the slices, we go back to the beginning and acquire segment B of slice 1, segment B of slice 2, and so on. So what this causes is a pretty long time interval between the segments within any individual slice. This is nice because it allows to on recovery, we can kind of maximize the signal in a given slice. But this long time interval between the segments really increases our vulnerability to motion. So our proposed reordering scheme, known as FLEET, what it does is it acquires, just sort of reorders the acquisition. We acquire segment A of slice 1, then segment B of slice 1, then segment C of slice 1, and so on. So we've actually minimized the time interval between the segments. This makes the this gives us a much less T1 recovery, so we're taking a little bit of hit in SNR of the ACS data, but we're much more robust to motion and dynamic phase changes. We call this FLEET. This is actually an old idea by Sir Peter Mansfield. It stands for Fast Low-Angle Excitation Opportunity Technique. It's kind of a hybrid between EPI and flash. Actually, we came up with this before there was multi-slice EPI, so the only way to do segmented. And so the idea is that in order to balance the magnetization across the shots, you use a TR, your flip angles. So based on your TR and T1, you can calculate the flip angle progression. It would give you equal magnetization across the segments. This is known as a FLEET, a variable flip angle. But also, because we have multiple T1s present in the system, it's kind of tough to kind of come up with one flip angle progression that works the entire brain. So it's also possible just to use a bunch of low flip angles, like say 20-20-20, which gives us equal magnetization across the shots. And this is the technique that we typically use for our ACS. So again, the idea is to just replace conventional multi-shot API with a FLEET acquisition. And this is nice. All you're doing is you're changing the ACS data, not changing anything else in the acquisition, not changing image reconstruction. You use a conventional graphic training and reconstruction.
And we've compared it with a sort of a newly implemented flash ACS. So here's a quick example. When we use either the flash or the fleet ACS, we eliminate the discontinuous SNR processes. Again, because we're removing the vulnerability in the conventional segmented DPI acquisition for the ACS, and this is giving us, less phase misalignment across the segments and letting properly extract. We're also seeing sort of across the board that the product ACS tends to have much lower SNR than the fleet ACS. We see about a 20% improvement in tSNR. Just by using the fleet. Now, this is including all slices. I think that in the back slices, even more the relative boost when we're using the fleet ACS. We compared this to a flash readout. The problem with flash is that it's not epispacing matched to the accelerated data. So whenever there's zero distortions, the flash ACS data doesn't match geometrically the accelerated data. So we see a much lower ghosting when we're using a fleet readout compared to the flash. And here's a quick example of the motion insensitivity. Here's a movie. It's taking a little while to get going. But you can see, so we built this mechanical phantom. It's an anthropomorphic head phantom. This is actually a really helpful device. Putting the scanner in a conventional ACS conventional MPRAGE. You can see the phantom's moving throughout the entire scan. You can see a lot of the scanners and artifacts because it's moving during the multi-shot, conventional multi-shot ACS acquisition, so that's bad. When we use the fleet acquisition, the phantom's still moving, of course, but all of these areas are artifacts of it. Because we're removing the vulnerability of the multi-shot ACS acquisition to motion. And just to quantify this effect, again, this is the same data, tSNR map. We see that the fleet in the conventional acquisition has purchase and SNR becomes a little bit higher, but of course, when in the presence of motion, the SNR plummets using the conventional acquisition, whereas the fleet is able to maintain high SNR. And again, what we saw was also that's a good question. So we have investigated this in the context of, I'm going to show in a couple of slides, we integrated this also with RCS other collaborations there. It does seem to have a little bit of an effect. I mean, what we see is that any kind of motion is going to affect the training with the kind of input acceleration, both rotation and also in this slide, it's showing a little bit of also respiration. We've also seen, I think I got one slide showing these aggregates, during the ACS acquisition from parasite differences. I do think that we're seeing less of an issue with rotational incline rotation than the but it's definitely still seeing it. But yeah, thanks for that. I still haven't looked at it systematically, that's sort of anecdotal, but I think we are seeing this. But just to kind of characterize the effect of breathing, so then when you breathe, your chest fills with nothing air, and it causes these little change in the head. So here, again, sort of typical free breathing acquisition, we see this discontinuous SNR that I've been complaining about. If we use the fleet, we actually get rid of this discontinuous SNR, as I showed you before. We also get sort of across the board increase in tSNR. But when we ask the subjects to hold their breath, yes, which is about 20 seconds, I'm actually not very happy. Again, that's not we're eliminating the sort of dynamic zero changes that cause space misalignment across the segments. This enables rapid use to happen to eliminate this discontinuous SNR issue. And again, if you run fleet during a breath hold, isn't effective, of course. So the idea is you can either use fleet, or you can ask the subjects to hold their breath during the ACS acquisition. It's to show you that, there it is. Yeah, and just to make the point, this issue isn't about, signal intensity differences across slices. It's not like a slice profile issue. It is the instability or time series instability issue. So this, here I'm showing you the time series standard deviation of these data. So you can see that in normal free breathing case, we're seeing that the time series standard deviation is discontinuous across the slices. Whereas when you have this so it's not a signal intensity issue, it's a signal variability issue across time. And what's funny is that the first time we did this, we were surprised to see that, just on a scanner, we just did a standard deviation walk, and we see very clear that charts quite a bit across slices. Now what's nice about the fleet ACS, it's also pretty short, just to show you real quick. The fleet ACS has advantages over flash. One of them is that it's much shorter acquisition. So in this case, It's about 1/3 the duration of the flash ACS acquisition. So again, the fleet ACS removes this SNR discontinuity, which is caused by motion or respiration, increases the tSNR, and reduces ghosting in the presence of B0 and homogeneity, which is especially important for high field. As I mentioned, I'm just going to show you real quick. I mean, I think this is kind of obvious. We've applied this to our SMS. We've sort of reordered the acquisition of our SMS calibration in order to make it more motion insensitive. The idea is that, the conventional SMS, say you're doing acceleration factor of 3, you would acquire, say your 3 slices simultaneously and tile the entire brain. The way it would typically acquire the reference data, is to simply just do it sequentially, and of course this causes a big time gap between the slices that are plotted in accelerated version. So it's kind of a simple idea, but all we did was sort of reorder the acquisition of the slices to make the calibration for the SMS data a bit more robust to motion. So a simple idea. This is the one example I was mentioning to you. Again, this is during free breathing. This is one we've incorporated. This is both, this is knowing plane acceleration, MB factor of 6. We're seeing, pretty good image quality. Wait, what's what here? Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I got confused here. I just put these in this morning. So this is acquisition using a conventional SMS that you can see people SMR, but once we use the SMS fleet, we actually get a pretty nice increase in SMR during free breathing. Also, these are the eyeball artifacts I was mentioning to you. You're seeing acquisition continuous artifacts here in the external lobe. We use the fleet SMS, these artifacts are removed. We've also incorporated this into our 7T data. You can see again quite clearly in the presence of motion, we get some pretty strong dosing artifacts. We use the conventional acquisition, which are removed when we use the SMS fleet. Okay, so as I mentioned, I think that the benefits of this motion-sensitive ACS is that, any motion during this 1/22nd vulnerable period you expect is to correct the entire motion. It's this really critical moment where, you really need the most accurate data as possible. Well, nowadays, since we're pushing the recons further and further, the reconstruction times are really lagging. So typically what we used to do back in the day is, if you saw a bad scan, we would just stop and restart because, if the subject was coughing during the ACS, you can just restart the scan. But nowadays, since the recon is usually lagging by many minutes, it's tough to do that. You don't know that the scan is corrupted until the subject's out of the scanner. Also, it enables higher acceleration factors. This problem gets worse and worse as we go to higher and higher acceleration. I think that's all I'd like to say about that. So I'd also like to talk to you about another couple of projects we run. The world got these slides we've been looking at Jason Stockman. He's been looking at B0 shimming, looking at spherical harmonic shimming compared to arrays of local shim coils. This is kind of a typical B0 map after sort of standard second order spherical harmonic shimming. So Jason's been simulating the effects of using multi-coil shims. These are arrays of local shim coils tiled around the head in the same geometry as our receive coils. We can see that we can eliminate, especially around the frontal sinuses with 32 of these local shim coils, we can eliminate a lot of the B0 inhomogeneity in the brain. So what Jason has done with Larry is they've realized that they can actually use the same conductor used for NAV coils for local shim coils. Because the shims are sort of DC and RF and RF, they can actually serve the same conductor. So what he's done is he's taken an existing 32 channel coil and added to it, just by a couple of a couple of chokes and some guide wires. He's able to actually use the same conductors for local shimming, which is pretty cool. So and it's nice also because apparently since there's so slow inductance on these coils, you can switch the current really quickly. So I think he said that for that 10, 20, 30 microsecond switching time. So this enables dynamic shimming, and also because the coils are so close to the head, the current requirements are very low because the magnetic fields are so close to the tissue. So here's an example of his first in vivo shim results. Is a 3T, working on a 7T version now. So here you see the kind of second order the results of kind of typical kind of product second order shimming, the predicted B0 maps using a multi-coil shim array, and his measurement in vivo. You see that with just 10 amps of current total, he can reduce the B0 inhomogeneity by about 50%. Pretty exciting. He's also applied it to EPI. Here we're looking at on the left, EPI images using a second order shim, a typical second order shim, this is in the one, EPI is in a multi-coil shim. So this is cool because, again, he's not taking up any more real estate for the shim coils. It's using the exact same conductors as the RF array. So I think this is really cool, very exciting technology. What's nice is that, as I mentioned to you guys before, we just remove the distortion, we do this typically by accelerating, there's some limits to how far we can accelerate. So if we can eliminate some of the V0 distortions through the shim coils, we can take some of the burden off of our parallel imaging acceleration and achieve high resolution EPI with distortion mitigation. Another kind of project I wanted to mention to you guys, this is in collaboration with Andre Vanderpoel. We've been looking at, high resolution MPRAGEs. So just like the EPI data that I showed you guys before, during the MPRAGE, we do a version, we read out many different ones. During the MPRAGE readout, there's some T1 recovery. This causes a multiplicative widening of the free space, which causes, again, a convolution or a blurring of the image data. And this blurring is, of course, a function of the T1 tissue process to ensure the recovery for the whatnot and vice versa. So this results in kind of tissue-dependent T1-dependent blurring function, which is also a function of the readout of the MPRAGE. So we thought, to try to reduce this readout by employing parallel imaging, we thought that maybe we can accelerate during the inversion recovery. People thought this is crazy, you can accelerate during the inversion recovery, but we do the same thing during the T2 to start with the MPRAGE. So the idea here is to reduce the readout during the inversion recovery by using parallel imaging in the inner loops. We're calling this inner loop grappa. This reduces the readout, and this can also substantially reduce the blurring due to the T1 recovery during these readouts. Also, it gives us a more kind of representative inversion time. Typically, the inversion time is the center of the readout, and that's not really representative of this readout. So the nice thing is that we get a better T1. What we can do now is, now that we're accelerating these readouts, we can actually incorporate multiple readouts per inversion recovery. Each readout is short, so each readout has very little blur, but we can tack in multiple readouts, each of which has its own TI. So during one readout, we can actually get multiple contrasts. And this is nice because not only is each contrast going to have reduced blurring and reduced distortion, but we can take all these readouts together, each of which have different TI, and fit T1, the quantitative T1 maps. This is sort of analogous to Andre's multi-echo API, where he increased the readout direction, increased the bandwidth in order to make the readout shorter, to reduce the distortion in the readout direction. And he this enabled him to achieve multiple echo times. So here we're extending this idea. We have a single readout that has multiple echo times, multiple inversions. We can set up the TVs to give us multiple contrast with which to be star. We can use multiple inversions to fit T1. So it's going to tile this parameter space. We've played with 3 echo, 3 inversion, 4 echo, 1 inversion, 1 echo, 4 inversion. Here's one example. This is a single 6-minute acquisition, 900 microns isotropic, 4 echoes, 3 inversions. Here you see the echoes across the horizontal axis, the inversions across the vertical axis. What's nice is that you can combine all of this data in multiple ways. You can just do sum of squares combination to pull back the SNR, so the only signal losses are due to the package. What's also nice is because each of these readouts kind of has its own alpha term. The phase evolution across each of these individual readouts is the same, so you can actually combine the data as complex values. So there's really the only signal loss is due to grappa G factor. But as I mentioned, because we have multiple contrasts, we can actually fit parameter estimates. Here we're showing both a T1 map and a PD map from our gold standard on the left, and the so-called multi-echo, multi-inversion MPRAGE. This is you can think of this as a generalization of the MP2 range acquisition, so we've been calling it MPX range. You can accelerate by a factor of 3, 4, 5, and as you accelerate to higher and higher factors, you can include more and more TIs. So here's an example. We just combined using RMS. This is the volume bias correction, again, 900 microns isotropic, and of course we pump this through FreeSurfer. So again, I think this is an important technique, not only because it gives us more contrast with which we can do quantitative ML, but it also reduces the blurring. One acquisition, actually, this is our first application of this sort of inner loop grappa accelerating during the partition recording. We actually did this, I think, last year at HBR. This is a record 390 micron isotropic, adult, in vivo testing. Of course, we only could do this with Dylan's perspective motion correction, but again, the problem is that as the readouts in the range get higher and higher, get longer and longer, and achieve these small voxels, you can get more and more blurring. So a lot of people now are moving towards high resolution or small voxel MPRAGE, but I think that there's so much blurring in the partition encoding direction that we don't have the voxel sizes of different. So we think that this inner loop grappa technique can help us to achieve very small voxels, true, honest, small voxel acquisitions of MPRAGE. The point of this study was actually to sort of validate our second consensus. And what's nice is that, so the red lines correspond to the 1 millimeter kind of MPRAGE, FreeSurfer beta, and the blue surfaces correspond to a FreeSurfer from this 290 micron beta. What's nice is that actually the surfaces agree on
pretty well. We were kind of encouraged that the FreeSurfer reconstruction from the 1 millimeter data was as accurate as it was. But we do see in a couple of places, we do see that there's some disagreement. We do see that maybe some higher resolution MPRAGEs could improve the accuracy of the FreeSurfer.
Area which is thinner and brighter in T1, so you have less apparent contrast. You think it's actually better when we multiple.
Absolutely, yes. I think that one of the very nice thing about the multi-inversion, that is you can fit T1. What's funny too is that I'm about to show you. We tried doing some recons after the T1 map, because of exactly the point you mentioned. Actually, T1 is shorter than the visual cortex, for example. There's less. Yeah, exactly. So what's funny is that even with a quantitative T1 map, true durability of T1 effects. But the point is that we think that smart voxels can help. Actually, what's funny about this is that our main goal here was to eliminate the errors in the surface reconstruction to go down. But what's funny is that even with 390 microns, we're still getting direct contamination. I think that means some of the standards to do it. But at least sort of giving us some clarity data for the very right interface. I think this data has been really useful so far. So the point is that this wouldn't have been possible without the inner loop grappa because the readouts in the partition direction was so long that the image would be completely blurred in that direction. Okay, so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Okay. So another idea that we've been playing with is high-resolution T1 mapping using API. Again, our API quality is getting so good nowadays. In fact, everybody's getting some kind of T1 mapping. So here's we see that we developed this kind of old idea. It's close enough to look at. All we're doing is we do an inversion. We read out all of our API slices because each slice is a different TI. And we repeat it, do the inversion again, give it all the slices, but we create the order of the slices. If you do this enough times, enough inversions, enough permutations, each slice gets each TI. So the key images actually come in on the scan. So in this case, we did 24 contrasts. This is 1 millimeter isotropic single shot API. 120 slices, that's the limit. We were able to achieve all of these contrasts, 24 contrasts, in just less than 3 minutes. So what we can do with this data is we can actually fit T1 recovery to T1 voxel. So this is the values across all of these 24 contrasts for T1 voxel. We can actually fit T1. Actually, we're doing this not with a parametric closed form model. We're doing it with kind of a block sim. This is now called MR fingerprinting. But the point is that we can use this to derive T1 maps. So here's an example. So kind of residual is we call it S-NOT, that's rho plus T star. This is a residual. We're going to call it a T1 map from this data, with which we can synthesize an image, an API image with MPRAGE like contrast, which is nice because it has very little T2 star contrast within it, and because it's basically quantitative T1, it's less vulnerable to any kind of bias field. And of course, we can take this data with a little bit of work and pump it through FreeSurfer. So here's some examples of the surface recons, and the subcortical segmentations. So this is nice because here we have surfaces generated from FreeSurfer directly on nuclei data that's distortion matched towards the idea here is that we're not going to use this for morphometry, and still MPRAGE is going to have a lot better geometric accuracy. But for fMRI studies, where we want our surface models to do fMRI analysis, we want the surface models to be as matched to the bowl data as possible. So the idea here is that we can generate surfaces within the API data so that they're perfectly distortion matched to the fMRI. And we've been using these data not only for kind of cortical studies, but also for some subcortical. We've been combining. Again, since our API quality, we put a lot of effort into it. We're actually able to achieve both API, cuneate API, diffusion API. I'm not sure when we're actually doing some susceptibility. And that thing using API using an asymmetric spin. So all of these are just completely distortion matched, and we can therefore combine all these different contrasts for a multimodal API exam. One of our first studies was looking at the brainstem. We're actually looking at assistant data at 7,000. This is a topic. We're able to see an individual components of analysis, those that correspond to the nuclei in the thalamus, which correspond quite closely to the FA map shown over on the right. What's nice is that we're seeing very high reproducibility across subjects. These are 12 of our subjects. We're actually seeing this one example area of VTA. We're seeing very high consistency across individuals. But what's nice is that this indicates sort of what it was mentioned before, and that is the potential for segmentation to be able to perform single subject imaging, which I think is quite important. We tried one continuous pain study in the cuneate nucleus,
actually also across 12 subjects, we're actually able to see. So the cuneate is first relay body that relays sensory information to the body. And the idea here is that we're hoping to apply this to
pain subjects. Again, the fact is we can see this one nucleus in single subjects, and we think this is going to be passing us a analysis.
So with that, I think I'll just wrap up. So as I mentioned, so 7T offers increased contrast-to-noise ratio needed for small voxels, although it poses some challenges to spatial accuracy, and these challenges, a lot of these distortions and artifacts can be mitigated in part by acquisition strategies. We've also seen that the vascular anatomy and physiology place some limits on biological resolution of fMRI, but there's both regularity and fine-scale regulation of the vasculature that we can exploit to achieve high resolution. This anatomically informed sampling that I showed you gives us a way to merge our small voxels that we can now achieve with our API with some understanding of the vascular anatomy or physiology to, again, yield high spatial accuracy. And finally, I mentioned a couple of techniques that we've been developing with the goal of further increasing our accuracy. So with that, I'd like to thank you guys for your attention. I'd like to thank my slide contributors and my colleagues, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Actually, so there, because this is at 17, so we're actually using this adiabatic pulse. So I think we're using like a foci pulse now, and CID is where it's really motion recovery. And it's not a blocker because each slice only gets one alpha. Yes, yes, so the alpha is something like that. But again, the hope is that we try a bunch of different alphas. So we're using language to 2 noise language. The hope is that a lot of these factors will fall out and things as well.
Work, or do you need a more rapid state to characterize
That's interesting. That's interesting. The tunes are longer. I mean, I think that actually you have a little more flexibility for a lot of these other methods. Because one of the issues is that we need to sample quickly enough before all of the T1s are converted. So actually, all of the T1 might be enough for just but it seems like a first blush, it's also true that once you look at these different populations, all of the parameters of the accuracy are going to change also. So it's probably worth taking a look at the whole thing. I think that you might not need as many partitions, for example, as you can look at. So I think that we're out of that. So I think it's a little problem, but I think that a lot of the T1 is not necessary. So I think the basis of it, to exploit, to let the tissues differentiate, you might need to spend the longer, but it's over 2 hours, for example. So it's going to prolong, and then you have less partitions to balance out.
I think you have a disease for something like needs factor. Normal mind that happens is the range of things is much bigger.
Well, that's an important point, and it's also true that when you were first setting up these protocols, we're trying to figure out how to optimize for 351 how to set up version times for 351. But we're seeing even in our normal speaks a lot of the T1 across the brain, and so we actually have a pretty long list of TIs. We're not even sure that you can cover. So I think that, for example, in the US stuff, I think our TIs are enormous. CSF really about 2 points. So we have really long range. I mean, I want to say for 1 to 1 so. I think the shortest TI was about 4 milliseconds. I think that they were about 7 seconds. So I really make sure that he was getting everything. And what's nice is that, for the T1 stuff, also because we have 120 slices, it takes a while. We haven't put SMS in that, but it takes a long time to get all the slices. So we're automatically sort of forced to have a long repetition time. So kind of at some level get this nice wide range of TIs. I think that, I think that's pretty long. I think the repetition time there, the time between the boosts was like 7 seconds. that's interesting. I guess it depends on the disease, of course, and I guess it's possible. I mean, I think that they have towards second accounts in these techniques to increase the neurovascular impact to patients. The main issue is just that you don't have a proper negative map. So sometimes you get false negatives that are simply because of the issue. It's like a pathological tissues. But I can sort of, I mean, obviously, once the system becomes unknown, obviously, pathways would happen. Some types of clear vessels. But are you asking for the clear vessels to more? Right, but being back up, they go all the way down to as well. It's true that we haven't really looked at how these ideas would be affected by different pathological conditions. And as I said, we've done a bit of CNMI really response with really wrong. But again, I think that might affect, since that's more on the material side, that might affect, one could, for example, might affect the small vessels of the large vessels. So that's an interesting point. Some have a kind of I think it's one possibility. That's a good question.
So, and one of the things I kind of skipped over, I mean, maybe I'll just show it real quick, just as a backdrop on saying, I mean, so we have been trying to do some angiography at the moment.
And it's tricky because, so first of all, with this, to start, this nice is that we're getting increased venous contrast because it's more susceptibility with that. But what's tricky though is you can see, it's kind of tough to see the key vessels because it's kind of a black type technique, and a lot of times you don't really see, there's no signal to subtract from on the surface. So that's what tricky. Also, as you know, this is kind of an anisotropic effect, you get more effects compound, these are the perpendicular. So this has been tricky. I was kind of joking about doing MRV with TSE or something like that, where you get more signal in the background. But this has been tricky. We're also looking at flight, which is that because if you want to get more from blood, it's actually you get better kind of info contrast, etc. This is non-contrast MRA. With the problem with these data is just that we actually get some signal from station tissue because they don't come from the special transfer. So the point is that we've been trying to recover these data into our analysis. And the problem with both of these methods is there's a lot of false negatives. If you don't see a vessel there, it doesn't mean there's a thing. I think a lot of people have been trying to look at nucleus themselves, and trying to look at nucleus themselves, and kind of see a vertical signal board and know what's going on. I try things like Thomas looking up to, just looking at, making a plot of the fold variability on the surface, and just projecting it onto the surface, from the boxes on the keel surface, projecting it onto a particle surface model, and seeing if this looks like, the vascular. And I did. I don't know why, I mean, maybe we need more averages. Yeah, and also with tricky is that another thing we're looking at is trying to measure physiology. So if we can measure cardiac, respiratory, and CO2, we do know that there are more sources of physiological noise at the surface. The problem is most of our measures of that physiological noise are systemic, like the bellows or pulse oxygen. And we're starting to see that these systemic signals, after they propagate through the brain, they kind of they're filtered a little bit to feel differently across the bone. Sometimes we're seeing places where the signals are interacting in some weird ways. And but you're right, I'd love to dig into this more. But again, we have been kind of hammering this stuff. I feel like it's not at the stage yet where, we really have confidence in it. And most of the time, actually, what's nice about this scenario is that we treat it here because, typically we kind of sat out the sagittal sinus and we get just the arteries. The solar there is through the roof, so at 17, we actually take out that sacrament. So actually, we're getting kind of inflow effects on the external side and the inner side, which is, feature anecdote, like, so I think that obviously a lot of times because we're trace back, what are the ways how we're on the inner side, but we are getting involved in the chip, because the top slide is it's only measuring like blood that's flowing into your slab, so you really need to pick your slab very carefully. I'm not sure. But that completely wipes out the issue. I mean, we haven't played with some conversations, especially for the MRI, but again, so a lot of these tend to really have like a pretty big effect on the surface. The vessels are separated, they wipe out the top half of the cortex. That's really important to define that. So. The collection of images. And you're correct. Yeah, there's some stretching effects. Yeah, it's funny. And it's, yeah, it's a good question. And there's a couple of tricks that we can play as we foundation. Tricks we can play in order to ensure that a lot of these questions, sometimes they overcorrect. I talk about the shim example.
Yeah. Yeah, the shim example, I mean, don't get me wrong, that was his first attempt. I think I saw what you saw, which is that it looks like maybe
he's kind of too much. Yeah, but something's better. Yeah, but I think that it's the problem with these local shim curves is that they don't have so many degrees of freedom. I think one game that we can play, which is because all of the distortion flies in the direction of the phasing, what we can do is use actually flip the direction of the phasing. So all the distortion is not going in the opposite direction. It's nice validation because if you apply the distortion correction to both of these images, in theory, if you're correct, there's one kind of validation that we can play. Also, we can have multiple we can apply different types of reality. Even apply the statement to shock as well as distortion. And just sort of kind of cross-validate. I'm not sure that's the right word, but sort of validate these distortions by applying them basically to. Yeah, that's a great point. And in general, this distortion correction is tough business. I mean, just thinking of flip map and doing distortion correction, you oftentimes make things worse. And distortion correction is tough, which is why I really like Polimeni as a means to sort of eliminate the distortion, rather than correcting apply images that are relatively distorted through. I think that it's much safer. So yeah, I think this is again as very first pictures. I agree with you that I think that could be refined, but I think it's a promising.
Sure. Do I just stop?